All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling a topic that needs zero introduction, World War II.
It's amazing how much of our world today really can be traced back to this one period in history.
Yeah, we often hear about the big battles, the numbers, the dates, but today I kind of want to get into the why behind the what.
Absolutely.
So instead of just listing dates and names, we'll uncover the chain of events, the stuff that was simmering below the surface for years, setting the stage for this huge global conflict.
Yeah, and it's not just history. It's like the foundation for understanding so much about like modern geopolitics and international relations.
Totally. So we're diving into excerpts from, this might sound kind of dry at first, but we're going into Wikipedia's World War II entry.
Okay.
And trust me, there's more to uncover than you might think. So how about we start with the obvious? 1939, Germany invades Poland. It's often seen as the war's start, right?
Right?
But it feels almost misleading to just say, and then the war began, like it
Yeah.
appeared out of nowhere.
Exactly. It wasn't like flipping a switch. That invasion, it was a catalyst, not the whole story. Imagine if you just skipped the entire first act of a movie, right?
Yeah.
You'd miss all that tension, that buildup.
Totally.
You got to rewind even further back to the aftermath of World War I, specifically to something called the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this treaty was supposed to prevent future wars, but it kind of backfired.
Right. How so?
It actually became this breeding ground for resentment.
Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles, this document, it's not just a piece of paper, it's like a major player in this whole thing.
Absolutely.
But how did it actually contribute to World War II?
Well, the treaty, it put incredibly harsh punishments on Germany. We're talking crippling war reparations, accepting sole blame for the war, the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
This created, understandably, a really deep sense of humiliation and economic hardship in Germany.
It just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Hmm.
A nation that's humiliated, economically crippled. No wonder resentment was just brewing.
Exactly. And it's not like this anger was just simmering in isolation. This was also a time of global instability. New ideologies were popping up everywhere, offering solutions that seemed pretty appealing at the time.
Right.
Take fascism in Italy, for example. They promoted extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, promised to restore order and strength.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, it's like we've heard this song before. And then there's militarism in Japan,
Right.
putting so much emphasis on military strength and expansion, seeing that as the only way to achieve national goals.
Exactly.
But these ideologies, they weren't just contained to Europe, right? I mean, you can't forget about Japan's invasion of Manchuria back in 1931. That was a huge red flag, years before 1939.
Huge red flag. Japan's government at the time, very militaristic, they saw Manchuria, this resource-rich region in China,
Mm.
as this key strategic asset. This invasion was just blatant aggression. They completely disregarded international law. It really showed their growing ambitions.
It's like they were testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before anyone really reacted.
And then, of course, there's the Spanish Civil War, which went on from 1936 to 39. It almost feels like a dress rehearsal for World War II, with all the major players testing out their weapons, their tactics.
Yeah, it's a tragic comparison, but it's apt. The Spanish Civil War became this proxy war. Germany and Italy supported Franco's fascist forces, while the Soviet Union backed the Republican government. It allowed these future World War II combatants to refine their strategies, test out new technologies. I mean, we're talking about everything from tanks to aerial bombardment.
It's just chilling to think about it like that. The Spanish Civil War, basically a training ground for the deadliest conflict in human history.
Right. And we can't forget about the border clashes between Japan and the Soviet Union. These happened in the late 1930s as well. Now, these clashes were smaller in scale, but they were indicative of Japan's growing aggression. They really wanted to expand their influence, even if it meant going up against a powerful neighbor like the Soviet Union.
It's like by the late 1930s, we're not just talking about random, isolated incidents anymore. It's a whole pattern of escalating tension.
Yeah. Got the Treaty of Versailles creating this undercurrent of resentment, instability. Then you have these dangerous ideologies like fascism and militarism gaining traction.
Right.
And then on top of all that, you've got these early conflicts, like in Manchuria and Spain. It's like watching a domino effect in slow motion. You can just sense that something massive is about to happen.
It's true. And what's so fascinating is that each domino, each of these events has its own story. You know, its own unique set of causes and consequences. Like, if you really want to understand the motivations of the German people and their leaders, you have to go deeper than just saying the Treaty of Versailles caused resentment.
Right.
You have to dig into the nuances.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of this complex puzzle, trying to figure out how each piece fits into the bigger picture.
Exactly. And as we go deeper into World War II, we're going to see this interconnectedness again and again. It's like that domino effect, that we were just talking about. Each domino adds to the next and the next.
Right, right. Well, that chain reaction, it reaches its tipping point in 1939.
With Germany's invasion of Poland. But, okay, this wasn't your typical military campaign. Our source material talks about this new type of warfare, blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg.
Even the word itself just sounds, like, intense.
It does have a certain ring to it. Lightning war is a pretty good description, actually. Imagine a military force that moves with so much speed and coordination that it just overwhelms the enemy before they can even react.
Wow.
That's blitzkrieg in a nutshell. Germany used this combination of tanks, mobile infantry, and air support all working together to just punch through enemy lines. It was devastatingly effective.
Yeah, it's like they completely threw out the old rules of warfare. I mean, think about World War I, all that static trench warfare just dragging on for years.
Right.
This blitzkrieg strategy must have seemed like ancient history compared to that.
Oh, absolutely. And, it wasn't just about the technology either. It was the thinking behind it. The Germans, they really prioritized mobility and surprise. Their opponents were constantly caught off guard, demoralized. And you really see this in the fall of France in 1940.
France, I mean, we're talking about a major European power here, brought to its knees in just weeks.
Weeks. It was a crushing defeat that showed the world just how powerful Germany had become. And it left a lot of people wondering, who could possibly stop them?
It's hard to imagine. But okay, so while everyone's focused on Western Europe, this whole other conflict is unfolding.
Oh, yeah.
The Eastern Front.
The Eastern Front. It was a completely different kind of war, a clash between these two massive powers, Germany and the Soviet Union.
Right. And it was brutal. You always hear the Eastern Front described as this war of attrition, this just grueling struggle for survival. Our source material really doesn't hold back when it comes to describing the conditions.
Yeah.
Vast distances, those harsh Russian winters.
Brutal.
And the violence, just unimaginable.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front. You're talking about millions of soldiers and civilians caught up in this just relentless struggle. And it was fueled by ideology, sure, but also just this desperate, primal need to survive. The siege of Leningrad, I mean, that's one example, but it really highlights the human cost of this conflict.
The Siege of Leningrad, that lasted for how long? It was over 2 years, right?
872 days.
Yeah.
872 days of siege. That's almost 2.5 years.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it. A city completely cut off, the people inside facing starvation, disease, constant bombardment.
Nightmare. A living nightmare. But it also shows the resilience of the human spirit, Even amidst all that devastation and despair, the people of Leningrad held on. They refused to surrender. And that resilience, that determination, it played a key role in turning the tide of the war.
Wow. Speaking of turning tides, our source points to 1942 as this pivotal year in the war. Not necessarily because of one specific battle, but because something much bigger shifted.
That's right. 1942 marked a turning point. You had the entry of the United States into the war, which fundamentally changed everything.
And that, of course, was spurred by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Right. An event that shocked the American public, really galvanized the nation.
Definitely. Japan, it seems like their plan was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but instead they woke up a sleeping giant.
Exactly. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a huge gamble. Japan was hoping for a quick victory, something that would cement their power in the Pacific. But they totally underestimated the United States, underestimated their industrial capacity, their sheer will to fight back.
And that industrial capacity, it really was a game changer, wasn't it? The U.S. had the resources, they had the manufacturing power, and they became this absolute arsenal for the Allied forces.
It's true. The U.S. just churned out ships, planes, tanks, you name it.
Yeah.
Their production numbers were astonishing.
And that ability to just outproduce the Axis powers, particularly when it came to shipbuilding and aircraft production, that became crucial.
Absolutely crucial. It really highlights how important logistics and industrial strength are in modern warfare. Wars aren't just won on battlefields anymore.
So the U.S. is pumping out resources, supporting the Allies, but it wasn't just about having more stuff, right?
You need to use that stuff effectively.
Exactly. And the source material highlights some key victories that really shifted the momentum of the war. Like, take the Battle of Midway, for instance.
Midway was a turning point, absolutely, especially in the Pacific. June of 1942. The Japanese Navy, they suffered a major defeat there. They lost 4 aircraft carriers.
Oh, wow.
It was a blow they never really recovered from.
A clash of aircraft carriers out in the vast Pacific. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? But those victories were hard won. And then, of course, on the other side of the world, you've got D-Day.
D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy. I mean, everyone's seen the movies, read the books. It's legendary.
And for good reason. You can't overstate the sheer audacity of it, the bravery of those Allied soldiers. But it's also, strategically speaking, an incredible logistical feat.
Oh, absolutely.
The planning, the coordination that had to go into something like that,
Yeah.
the sheer scale of it was just mind-blowing.
Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of troops. And it all comes down to this one day, these beaches in Normandy.
It's a testament to what humans can achieve when they work together, international cooperation, strategic planning.
For sure.
Yeah.
But even with the Allies making progress in Europe, in the Pacific, things on the Eastern Front, it just stayed this brutal, brutal battleground.
It did. The Eastern Front never let up. And the Soviet Union, they deserve so much credit. They endured just incredible losses, hardship beyond imagination, but they just kept pushing westward, pushing back against the Nazis, liberating Eastern Europe.
It's hard to fully appreciate how immense the fighting was on the Eastern Front. Even now, the battles were enormous, casualties just staggering.
That's where the vast majority of German forces were tied up, after all.
Right, right.
And the sacrifices made by the Soviet Union on that front, I mean, they played a huge role in the eventual Allied victory. But victory came at a heavy price for everyone involved.
It did. Our source really highlights that, the human cost of this war, an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths.
It's almost incomprehensible.
Those numbers, it's not just soldiers, it's civilians, people dying from disease, starvation, genocide.
You can't forget the horrors of the Holocaust either, orchestrated by Nazi Germany. It's this horrific reminder of what humans are capable of, the devastating consequences of unchecked hatred, of ideology gone wrong.
A truly dark chapter in human history, and a reminder that we have to learn from the past so we don't repeat those mistakes. But even with the war finally over, the world had changed. I mean, you can't just go back to the way things were before.
No, not at all. We talk about the human cost, but
Yeah.
World War II, it reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape.
Right. It's like hitting a reset button on global power.
Exactly.
So, okay, where do we even begin?
Well, the war, as devastating as it was, it actually weakens the European powers, politically and economically. And that created this space, this opening for decolonization movements all over the world. Think about it. Former colonies, many of whom had fought for the Allies, they started demanding independence.
Right, like India, for example, gaining independence in 1947, and then so many African and Asian nations following suit in the decades after. World War II basically redrew the map of the world.
It did. But then another tension was brewing. The wartime alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That fell apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, the Cold War, that's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
It is. But it's all connected, isn't it?
It is. It's like we started by talking about the Treaty of Versailles and the rise of these powerful ideologies, and then those very same forces end up shaping the world in the aftermath of the war.
It shows how interconnected history really is. The decisions, the ideologies, the conflicts, they all have these ripple effects, these consequences that last far beyond the immediate time and place.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. But I think that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We get to go beyond the typical dates and battles, uncover the why behind the what.
Yes.
We see how complex it all really was, and hopefully walk away with a deeper understanding of how we got to where we are today.
Absolutely. History isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about engaging with the past,
Yeah.
asking questions, understanding different perspectives.
And maybe, just maybe, learning from it all so we can create a better future.
That's the goal.
It is. Well, on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought. Given everything we've discussed today, the rise of nationalism, these global power struggles that are still going on, how can we use the lessons learned from World War II to build a more peaceful and cooperative future?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is, and one we should all be thinking about.